What made the Connecticut Sun so difficult to play against wasn't just their talent. It was their reputation. Night after night, they built an identity around relentless physicality, suffocating defense, and making every possession feel like a battle. Opponents knew they were walking into a war of attrition, and many fans believe that no player absorbed more punishment under that system's watch than Caitlin Clark. Throughout the season, clips circulated endlessly across social media. Hard screens. Aggressive body contact. Heated confrontations. Every controversial moment was dissected frame by millions of viewers who had never followed the WNBA before. To longtime basketball observers, it was simply playoff-style intensity. To Clark's rapidly growing fan base, it looked like something much more troubling. And whether that perception was fair or not almost became irrelevant. Because perception quickly became reality in the court of public opinion. Every time Clark hit the floor, every time a defender made contact, every time a game became overly physical, fans connected the dots back to the Connecticut Sun and the culture that Stephanie White was leading. As the season progressed, frustration grew louder. What started as isolated complaints transformed into a widespread belief that the league wasn't doing enough to protect its biggest star. So when Indiana announced White as the new head coach, many supporters didn't see an award-winning basketball mind. They saw the architect of the very environment they believed had targeted Clark all season long. That is why the backlash exploded with such incredible force. It wasn't simply about X's and O's. It wasn't about offensive systems. It wasn't even about wins and losses. For a large portion of the fan base, this hiring felt personal. They believed the organization had ignored months of frustration. They believed executives had overlooked the concerns of the people who had packed arenas, shattered television ratings, and elevated the franchise to a level of attention it had never experienced before. The reaction was immediate. Comment sections turned into battlegrounds. Debate shows dedicated entire segments to the controversy. Social media timelines became flooded with arguments from both sides. Some insisted White's coaching resume spoke for itself. Others argued that no amount of tactical expertise could erase what they viewed as a fundamental mismatch between coach and superstar. And then something unexpected happened. As White officially took control of the franchise, the conversations slowly began to shift. The same people who had passionately defended her arrival started noticing issues they hadn't anticipated. Questions emerged about rotations. Questions emerged about offensive pace. Questions emerged about whether the team's most dangerous weapon was truly being utilized to her full potential. Suddenly, the criticism wasn't coming exclusively from Clark supporters anymore. It was coming from voices that had originally celebrated the hiring. And that development may be the most fascinating twist of this entire story. Because when critics attack a coach, it's easy to dismiss them as biased. When loyal supporters begin asking the same questions, the conversation becomes impossible to ignore. Now, the pressure surrounding Stephanie White is reaching an entirely different level. The honeymoon period is over. The excuses are disappearing. And with expectations continuing to rise around one of the most watched teams in professional basketball, every decision, every substitution, and every possession is being placed under a microscope unlike anything the league has ever seen. Repeatedly emphasized that physical defense was simply part of playoff basketball, framing the controversy as an overreaction from passionate supporters rather than evidence of any coordinated effort to target a specific player. But that explanation did absolutely nothing to calm the growing outrage. If anything, it made the situation even worse. To the fan base that had spent months watching every possession under a microscope, White's comments felt dismissive. They felt like confirmation that the concerns being raised were never going to be taken seriously. Social media exploded with reaction clips, screenshots, and lengthy analysis threads as supporters revisited every controversial moment from the series, building an increasingly powerful narrative that would follow White long after the playoffs had ended. And that is precisely why her eventual hiring by the Fever generated such a fierce reaction. The issue wasn't simply that fans preferred another coaching candidate. The issue wasn't even that they disagreed with her basketball philosophy. For many of the most vocal supporters, White had become permanently connected to some of the most frustrating and emotional moments of the rookie's first professional season. Every hard foul, every controversial no-call, every heated exchange, every moment that left fans feeling like the league's biggest attraction was being forced to carry an impossible burden. All of it became attached to White's public image, whether fairly or unfairly. The result was a level of skepticism that few coaches have ever faced before coaching a single game for a new franchise. But as training camp arrived and the regular season finally began, something unexpected happened. Many observers assumed that once White started working directly with the team's superstar, the tension would quickly disappear. They expected improved communication, a fresh offensive system, and visible signs that both sides were committed to building a championship contender together. Instead, every game seemed to create a brand new debate. Supporters began questioning offensive pace. They questioned substitution patterns. They questioned whether the team was maximizing the unique skill set that had transformed a college phenomenon into one of the most recognizable names in professional sports. The criticism that once came exclusively from outside voices slowly started spreading into mainstream basketball conversations. Analysts began discussing whether the offense looked as dynamic as expected. Commentators debated player usage. Fans compared current performances to the fast-paced systems that had previously unlocked the superstar's full potential. And as those conversations intensified, the pressure surrounding White continued to grow. Because coaching a team with ordinary expectations is one thing. Coaching a team carrying this level of attention is something entirely different. Every decision becomes a headline. Every loss becomes a controversy. Every quote becomes a debate. And when a franchise has invested its future in a generational talent, patience can disappear incredibly fast. Now, as expectations continue to climb and scrutiny reaches unprecedented levels, the spotlight on Stephanie White may be brighter than ever before. The question is no longer whether fans were upset when she was hired. The question is whether she can ultimately deliver the results needed to silence the criticism once and for all. According to many reports and widespread fan discussions, represented the old guard of professional basketball leadership, a figure determined to ensure that organizational decisions would be driven by long-term strategy rather than the emotional swings of social media outrage. That revelation immediately created an entirely new layer of controversy. Because if the hiring truly reflected a deliberate philosophical decision from the top of the organization, then the debate was no longer just about Stephanie White. It was about power. It was about control. And it was about who ultimately gets to shape the future of one of the most closely watched franchises in all of professional sports. Supporters who had spent months campaigning for a specific vision of the team's future suddenly found themselves staring at an uncomfortable possibility. What if the front office wasn't trying to build the franchise around fan demands at all? What if executives were intentionally sending a message that basketball decisions would remain in the hands of basketball people, regardless of how loud the public reaction became? That possibility sent shockwaves throughout the online community. Every quote was analyzed. Every press conference was dissected. Every roster move became evidence in a much larger debate about the direction of the organization. On one side were fans who believed the franchise had a once-in-a-generation opportunity and needed to adapt everything around maximizing its biggest stars' unique talents. On the other side were those who argued that sustainable championship teams require structure, accountability, and a system that extends far beyond any single player, no matter how popular or talented that player might be. The collision between those two visions created an atmosphere unlike anything the league had ever experienced. And as the season progressed, the scrutiny only intensified. Every loss reignited old arguments. Every offensive struggle brought fresh criticism. Every tense sideline moment generated thousands of new theories. What might have been routine coaching decisions for another franchise suddenly became national talking points because of the enormous spotlight surrounding the team. Then came the development that nobody expected. Some of the very voices that had originally defended the hire began raising concerns of their own. Not because they suddenly agreed with every criticism. Not because they believed the original backlash had been justified. but because expectations were so incredibly high that anything short of visible progress immediately became a source of frustration. That shift changed everything. When criticism comes exclusively from opponents, organizations can often ignore it. When questions begin coming from supporters, insiders, and previously loyal defenders, the pressure becomes impossible to dismiss. And now Stephanie White finds herself operating under perhaps the most intense microscope any coach in the league has ever faced. Every game matters. Every decision matters. Every result matters. Because the debate that began the moment her hiring was announced never truly disappeared. It simply evolved. What started as outrage over the past has transformed into a high-stakes evaluation of the present, and with expectations continuing to climb higher than ever before, the spotlight surrounding the franchise shows no signs of fading anytime soon. Instead, according to many critics and online commentators, they may have unintentionally created one of the most closely scrutinized leadership experiments in modern professional basketball. Because the moment Stephanie White accepted the position, she inherited far more than a roster. She inherited a fan base already divided into competing camps, each carrying completely different expectations for what the future of the franchise should look like. One side viewed the hiring as a necessary correction, a return to structure, discipline, and proven basketball principles. They argued that championship organizations cannot allow social media pressure to dictate personnel decisions and believed the front office deserved credit for making what they saw as a difficult but professional choice. The other side saw something entirely different. To them, the move symbolized a direct challenge to the momentum that had transformed the franchise into a global phenomenon. They believed executives were ignoring the obvious lessons of the previous season and attempting to force a generational talent into a system that wasn't specifically designed to maximize her unique strengths. As those competing narratives grew louder, every development surrounding the team became magnified. A loss wasn't just a loss. It became evidence. A substitution wasn't just a substitution. It became a statement. A tense moment on the sidelines wasn't just frustration. It became a national conversation. The pressure surrounding White escalated with incredible speed because the expectations attached to the organization had reached levels rarely seen in women's basketball history. Fair or unfair, every decision was being judged through the lens of the controversy that surrounded her arrival. And that's where the story takes another fascinating turn. Because eventually, the discussion stopped being about rumors, theories, and historical grievances. It shifted towards something much more important. Results. The only thing capable of quieting a divided fan base is winning. The only thing capable of ending endless online debates is visible progress. And the only thing capable of changing public perception is success on the court. That reality placed White in an incredibly difficult position. Every game represented an opportunity to prove supporters wrong or give critics even more ammunition. There was virtually no middle ground. If the team succeeded, advocates would point to strong leadership and organizational vision. If the team struggled, opponents would argue that the warnings had been there from the very beginning. As the spotlight continued to intensify, one thing became undeniably clear. The controversy surrounding the hire was never just about Stephanie White. It was about competing visions for the future of the franchise. It was about the balance between tradition and transformation. It was about whether organizations should adapt to generational stars or expect generational stars to adapt to established organizational culture. And perhaps most importantly, it was about who ultimately gets to shape the direction of one of the most talked about teams in professional sports. Because in today's sports landscape, winning games is only part of the challenge. Winning the narrative can be just as difficult.